thank you very much for having New Zealand Winegrowers as part of your Drink Summit. I'm delighted to be speaking to an Australian audience, a very valuable export markets for the wines of New Zealand. I'm Charlotte Reid. I'm the General Manager of Marketing at New Zealand Winegrowers, and we are the industry body representing our grape growers and our wineries as the unified national body. And our purpose is to protect and enhance the reputation of New Zealand wine around the world and to drive sustainable and diverse value growth for the industry. Today, I'm joined here with Tessa Chilala, who is our Sustainability Advisor at New Zealand Winegrowers. And Tessa is our climate lead in our environmental team here. And Tessa's role, as we as an industry have committed to being carbon zero by 2050, her role with us is to help as an industry map our path for getting there. And so today we would like Tessa to be able to share some of the hard work that we've been doing here as an industry. And Tessa's background is perfectly suited for this challenge that we have ahead. Tessa has very rich experience in environmental matters, having worked for environmental consultancies in the past and helping us here in Auckland, at Auckland Zoo, reach its carbon zero status. So without further ado, I'll introduce you now to Tessa and handing over to you now.
Hi everybody, lovely to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to speak to our Australian audience today. We're really proud of where we're at so far on our climate journey, and we're especially excited to highlight some of our climate champions from the industry. Tēnā koutou katoa, welcome everyone. This is the presentation on the New Zealand wine climate story. This presentation aims to give some background to our industry target of being climate neutral by 2050, to show what climate action looks like at the industry level, and most importantly, to show what climate excellence looks like on the ground in the New Zealand wine industry. So let's get into it. New Zealand is small, as you know, our population is just under 5 million people. We only contribute around 0.2% of the world's carbon emissions, but our emissions per person are the 6th highest among industrialised countries. These are also known as Annex 1 countries. New Zealand's emission profile is different from most of the other 43 Annex 1 countries, in that nearly half of our emissions come from the agricultural sector, which you can see in the inner circle of this graph here. Typically, the agriculture sector constitutes only a small proportion, around 12% of gross emissions. Our unique carbon profile here in New Zealand requires a unique reduction strategy. So the lighter green bar here shows our national per capita average when agriculture, including dairy and beef, is taken into account. We have the 6th highest per capita emissions for all gases. And this is a really complex conversation. This isn't agricultural products that New Zealand is entirely consuming itself. Around 95% of that dairy that New Zealand produces is exported. And because we are a relatively clean producer of these products, if countries source that dairy from somewhere else, you could potentially see the global emissions from that production increase, even with transport accounted for. For carbon alone, that's the darker green bar you can see there. New Zealand's emissions are much lower than the average of the 41 industrialisations. Carbon here is used as a catch-all for all greenhouse gases, coming from pretty much everything other than agriculture. So transport, electricity, waste, manufacturing and construction is all included in here. Horticulture, including the growing of grapes, sits in here. However, this is the totality of our emissions based on our economy, and so those are the emissions we must take responsibility for reducing in line with global targets. For anyone who's interested, we pulled together a whole lot of research on the food miles issue. New Zealand, as you know, is a small island nation at the bottom of the globe, sending its premium products around the world because people are keen to buy them. So naturally, we field a lot of questions along the lines of how can a product be truly sustainable if it's shipped from New Zealand? And so that was a question we asked ourselves. The key message that came through the research is that distance does not simply equal a higher carbon footprint. Taking a life cycle assessment approach consistently demonstrates that GHG emissions associated with bringing food and beverage to market are dominated by the production and packaging phase. So the growing and processing of raw products such as grapes, and then getting them in bottles. The bulk of freight emissions from the global food and beverage trade is actually associated with road transport within countries, as opposed to cross-border shipments. In fact, one of the biggest contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions associated with the food product on a per unit basis is car travel by the consumer driving to the shop or market and then back home again. New Zealand wine is largely shipped by sea to our international markets, which is 10 times as efficient as on-road truck transport. Shortly, I'll go into how our certification scheme has begun to capture some key emissions associated with the production phase of our wine. But for anyone interested in digging down a bit into this issue, take a look at those food mile resources we put together. These are available on our website. New Zealand's lower than OECD average carbon emissions and a reason New Zealand is able to produce its wine efficiently partly reflects our high proportion of renewable electricity. Generated through hydro, geothermal, and wind. We currently meet 82% of our energy needs from renewable sources, and we have a national target in place to be 100% renewable by 2035. The OECD average renewable energy rate sits at around the 25% mark. Phasing out the last remaining use of coal is a priority in this transition. The OECD average for share of coal-fired electricity generation is 23%. New Zealand is under 5%, but that still needs to go as part of this transition. Forestry offsets roughly 1/3 of our gross national emissions. We account for emissions offset through forestry using the Kyoto Protocol accounting rules. Around 40% of New Zealand is covered in forests. Under the Kyoto Protocol, all forests are accounted for, but the rules differ depending on when the forest was actually established. In 2019, New Zealand became the first country to have enshrined in law both a zero emissions target and a requirement to set a path to get there through the passing of the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act. New Zealand has actually had a Climate Change Act in place since 2002, which established our emissions trading scheme. This was a fairly progressive piece of work at the time, and I'll go into more of that in a moment. The 2002 Act also established a national greenhouse gas inventory. The Amendment Zero Carbon Act of 2019 sets domestic reduction targets. And the journey to the current Act essentially looks like this. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or the IPCC, is a UN body set up in the 80s to assess the science around climate change. Its job is to provide governments with scientific information they can use to develop policies on global heating. They produce periodic reports which now essentially state that human activities have already caused around 1 degree of global warming above pre-industrial levels. That's that time when humans really started our love affair with fossil fuels. And that each incremental increase in warming will bring more extreme weather events. The Paris Agreement came into effect in 2016 based on the science that has been presented through the years in these reports. This is a legally binding international treaty on climate change. It was adopted by 196 countries at the UN Climate Change Conference in Paris, which is where it gets its name from. Its goal is to limit global warming to well below 2, but preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels to avoid the worst case climate scenarios. And to achieve this long-term temperature goal, countries must aim to be climate neutral by 2050. Each party to the Paris Agreement needs to set a nationally determined contribution, or an NDC, representing its highest possible ambition. New Zealand's 2019 Zero Carbon Act then translates the Paris Agreement targets into the domestic context and sets our NDC, which is that our net emissions will be 30% below 2005 gross emissions by 2030. The Act also sets into law 2 domestic targets, one for carbon and one for biogenic methane from agriculture, which basically comes from cows' tummies, most of it. So it treats these gases differently. This is the first time a specific target has been set for agriculture in New Zealand. And when you think back to that graph showing how half of our emissions come from agriculture, you can see that's pretty significant. So our 2 domestic targets are 1, net zero emissions of all non-agricultural greenhouse gases, or simply carbon, by 2050, and a 24 to 47% reduction against 2017 levels in biogenic methane by 2050. The New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme is New Zealand's key tool for meeting both international obligations under the Paris Agreement and our 2050 target and emissions budgets. The idea behind the ETS is that making businesses pay for their greenhouse gases will encourage them to reduce their emissions through changing their practices or investing in new technology. For every tonne of emissions that a polluter releases in a year, they have to surrender a carbon credit back to the government. The government then awards credits to forestry projects which are sinking carbon, and those credits can then be sold onto the ETS market back to polluters. The price of each credit rises according to the basic rules of supply and demand, and polluters will decide whether they want to fork out the cash for a credit or whether it would be more economical to stop emitting via decarbonising their business practices. Our wine growers and winemakers, along with the rest of the nation, have been participating in this scheme since its inception in 2008. It makes things like petrol and diesel more expensive. And by way of example, last month, this added about 11 cents onto the cost of a litre of petrol. Less than 4 months earlier, it added around 9 cents per litre. So the cost of emitting carbon is going up, and it will continue to do so. The conversation is now underway between government and the agricultural sector to price methane, either under the scheme or in a separate scheme. So this is the world we find ourselves in as the wine industry. In 2019, the New Zealand Winegrowers Board set a target for our industry to be carbon neutral by 2050, in line with those global targets and our domestic targets. And that was really the time we realised we needed to pause and take stock of what is the wine industry's place in this big climate picture. What is our role? What are our industry hotspots that we need to start addressing immediately, not waiting years for all the science to come in and to take action, although that's obviously really important too. And also, what tools do we have to run this work without placing too onerous a burden on our grape growers and winemakers? New Zealand is particularly vulnerable to the economic and environmental impacts of climate change because we are an island nation reliant on primary production and tourism for much of our economic wealth. This year, New Zealand's Independent Climate Change Commission released their first report providing advice to government on a national reduction plan for the period 2022 to 2025. The message in this report was that land use change is expected to become a part of New Zealand's transition pathway to a low emissions economy. They identified land use change from high intensity livestock agriculture to horticulture, around 100,000 hectares by 2050, as presenting a scenario where our more ambitious reduction targets are met. New Zealand Winegrowers also partnered with the government research agency that owns the only accredited carbon certification program in New Zealand, Toitū Envirocare, to take a look into this further. Just as an aside, the word Toitū is a Māori word which encapsulates concepts such as enduring, untouched, kept pure, and protected. Anyway, we got them to look into how wine growing stacks up through the lens of climate change. Their advice was that a move to planting grapes in areas suitable for quality wine production, currently used for more emissions intensive land, has great potential to help reduce New Zealand's emissions overall. They ran an assessment of land use greenhouse gas emissions of the wine sector compared with a range of other sectors in New Zealand, which showed grape growing to be a relatively low producer of emissions, both in absolute terms, and in terms of per dollar export revenue earned. That report is available on our website too for anyone who's interested. And this research was supported by work done by the New Zealand Productivity Commission in 2018, which looked at tonnes of CO2 emitted per hectare of land across several industries. A similar study in 2017 by Plant and Food Research here in New Zealand found the per hectare carbon emissions of vineyards were the lowest of the New Zealand horticultural primary industry studied, roughly 50% lower than the New Zealand kiwi fruit and apples, even when shipping was considered. So we have a fairly good sense of our place in the big picture. We have that confidence that wine growing is very much part of a low emissions future. Our challenge now is to get our industry informed and prepared and taking action. So this is a good point to jump into Sustainable Wine Growing New Zealand certification program, known as SWINS. SWINS is an industry-wide certification program led by New Zealand Wine. It launched in the mid-90s as a program based on continuous improvement and adherence to standards which ensure members meet international guidelines for sustainability practices in the vineyard and the winery. 96% of New Zealand's vineyard producing area is SWINS certified, with another 7% operating under recognised certified organic programs. Over 90% of wine produced in New Zealand is processed in SWINS certified facilities. And this level of industry-wide participation in a sustainability scheme is a massive point of difference for wine produced in New Zealand. SWINS certifies all parts of the production chain, from vineyard to winery to bottling facility to brand. And to be SWINS certified, all members must complete annual submissions and undergo regular on-site audits conducted by an independent verification company. Annual submissions are made through an online questionnaire covering off impacts across our 6 focus areas, which you can see here. These are soil, water, pest and disease, waste, people, and more recently, climate change. If a question is answered showing that a vineyard or winery practice does not comply with industry best practice, a corrective action is raised and the business has a window of time in which to remedy the issue. Wine made from grapes grown in 100% SWINS certified vineyards and produced in 100% SWINS certified winemaking facilities can display this SWINS logo on the bottle. This is the guarantee of sustainable production from grape to glass, so this is a good one to look out for anytime you're picking up a bottle of New Zealand wine. In terms of the climate change component of the questionnaire, 2021 was the first time the program included an explicit section on climate change. This certification is not designed to be a comprehensive carbon accounting scheme. Such schemes are highly specialised, they're expensive to run and audit, and they require significant time and inputs from businesses. Because SWINS is auditing impacts across multiple focus areas, the team had to take a really pragmatic approach to the inclusion of a climate section. And this is year 1. We're still learning as we go. We have a number of members around the country going through formal certification for the management of carbon, but we wanted to ensure that we're capturing at least those key sources of emissions from all of our members, regardless of the resources they have available to them. We partnered with New Zealand's leading accredited carbon certifier to ensure that while we are not providing a comprehensive carbon accounting system through SWINS, we are at least structuring our questions to align as closely as possible with international best practice, in this case, the ISO greenhouse gas standard. So they provided advice on our industry's key greenhouse gas emissions based on their database of comprehensive carbon inventories of real vineyards and wineries. So they provided us with almost like a hypothetical vineyard and a hypothetical winery based on real life industry data. Our SWINS questionnaire gets members to input their uses on electricity sources and consumption, transport fuels, including transport fuels used to move grapes from the vineyard to the winery, waste to landfill, and it also collects some data around packaging, so regular glass and bottles versus lightweight or refillable bottles, etc. There's also a question on the source of the glass itself, so whether it was produced in New Zealand or if it was produced in other countries where the energy inputs will be different, and there's a distance travelled by the empty glass bottle too. The questionnaire also captures the number of businesses who are already engaged in carbon management activities or formal certification schemes. Industry carbon emissions will be tracked through time through our SWINS member portal, enabling us to benchmark where we are now so that we can chart a better path to achieving that 2050 goal of carbon neutrality. As a step to demonstrating industry commitment to a low carbon future, and also to ensure the industry body ourselves understand the intricacies of the carbon certification process, New Zealand Winegrowers gained carbon reduced certification this year, which is that ISO standard for greenhouse gases and their management. So we have our mechanism for capturing key emissions from the growing of grapes and making of wine. We have an online dashboard for establishing baselines and identifying trends and reductions. There's also a lot of work going in to ensure that regardless of resources winemakers have to invest in carbon reduction, they have access to easy to understand, relevant and pragmatic advice. This is the reduce part of our climate strategy. The SWINS team provides some really great information to enable members to make informed choices on reducing their emissions. One form of this information is fact sheets for how to calculate diesel use. There are also action sheets on things like energy efficiency and efficient refrigeration techniques. Outside of the SWINS certification program itself, keeping our members informed on upcoming changes relating to the government's climate change reform agenda is an absolute focus for New Zealand Wine. Climate change education has a consistent presence now at virtually all member engagement events, including Grape Days, which is a viticulturalist focus forum, and Young Viticulturalist events. Of key importance currently and into the near future is preparing our members for upcoming changes to that emissions trading scheme that I discussed earlier, and why reducing carbon now makes good business sense. Our partnership with Toitu EnviroCare saw the creation of a carbon reduction guide that is tailored for the wine industry based on those real life examples of wine industry carbon inventories. Understanding the size of different emission sources can inform the strategy for identifying areas for improvement. The purpose of this guide is to do just that, in order for our members to take a targeted approach to reduction actions in lieu of them undergoing a formal carbon inventory themselves, because not everyone can afford to do that immediately. Under each key emission source, the guide provides pragmatic reduction actions and external resources for further support as well. Industry peer-to-peer learning and innovation sharing has been supported through the launch of our Sustainability Guardians program, which has a climate change working group. This working group provides members with an opportunity to engage with industry champions and other service providers who can assist them on their climate change mitigation journey. The first climate change webinars hosted by the program included presentations from carbon management experts and members on the reduction journey, including a representative from Wineworks discussing the experience of a carbon neutral winery, bottling and warehousing provider. So hopefully that gives you an idea of some of the climate work that's gone in behind that bottle of New Zealand wine you're holding. I want to round off this presentation by giving a few examples of what climate excellence really looks like in our industry, by highlighting just a few of our industry climate champions. First up is The Landing. This is a vineyard, winery and luxury residence on 400 hectares of coastal habitat of the Porirua Peninsula and the beautiful Bay of Islands in northern New Zealand. Caring for the environmental landscape and honouring their cultural history are two of the Landing's guiding principles, and for anyone who's interested, I would highly recommend taking a look at their sustainability report, which is available on their website. Something that I love in their sustainability report is they list Te Taiao, or the environment, as a key stakeholder that is considered in the formation of business objectives. I think that's the first time I've ever seen that, and I thought that was really cool. Another key stakeholder is the local hapu, or subtribe, Ngāti Torihina, and Te Tai Tokoro Iwi, or tribe, Ngā Pohi. So the Landing formally became a Carbon Zero certified organisation this year. They achieved carbon neutrality in part through growing their own carbon sink of regenerated native forest and wetlands. Their replanting, in fact, absorbs more than 3 times as much carbon as their business emits. Vegetation on the property has been increased from 88 to 125 hectares since the property was first purchased 20 years ago. In that time, over 1.2 million trees and native plants have been planted. Last year alone, they planted over 12,000 native seedlings, which are largely sourced from their own nursery. The image to the right here shows some of this regenerating bush nestled amongst the vineyards. But you can't become carbon neutral certified without demonstrating you're making reductions against long-term targets every year. Offsetting alone won't do it. Through the Carbon Zero certification process, the Landing have a thorough understanding of their key emissions and have set specific reduction targets against each one. These can be seen here in the graph in blue, which they include in their sustainability report. Their key emissions are those generated by transport fuels, particularly diesel, and the second largest part being generated by electricity usage. The Landing have a target to reduce purchased diesel by 10% through efficiencies in vehicle use, ensuring that the right-sized equipment is in use, and the phase-in of EVs staged over the next 3 years. They have a target to reduce purchased electricity emissions by 15% by 2023 through on-site renewable power generation in order to reduce dependency on backup diesel generators when there is supply insecurity. They're already sourcing the bulk of their purchased electricity from a local Northland geothermal power company called Ngafa Power, pictured here, which is obviously a renewable source of energy. Next up is the wonderful Lawsons Dry Hills in the Marlborough region of the South Island of New Zealand. Sustainability is nothing new to Lawsons Dry Hills founder Ross Lawson. He was a leader in the 2001 initiative to convert New Zealand wine companies to use screw caps rather than cork to ensure quality, but also to reduce wastage. Lawsons Dry Hills holds ISO certifications, not just for environmental management, but also for carbon zero. They were also awarded winner of the wine industry category at this year's Cawthron Marlborough Environment Awards. Their lightweight glass bottles are made in New Zealand with a minimum of 65% recycled content, and they made huge reductions in water use and plastic packaging. But in terms of their climate action, Lawsons Dry Hills carbon inventory revealed that freight, followed by diesel, were their largest contributor of emissions. They've made some great inroads in reducing the freight emissions on wine for export, which is around 80% of their wine. A key initiative to reduce these emissions has been stipulating conditions when they quote their terms for freight to leave directly from the local Nelson port in this picture here, as opposed to first trucking the bottles by road up to Auckland, which is around 780 kilometres per truck movement. They consolidate the movements to port in large B-train trucks versus numerous smaller volume movements. Diesel use has dropped through the investment in more efficient vineyard equipment, including tractors, and reducing the number of passes in the vineyard. They've reduced refrigeration emissions through using flotation for settling wine, rather than relying on refrigeration, and through upgrades to insulation on refrigeration lines and tanks. As well as reductions they've already made against their baseline carbon footprint, they have a commitment to further reduce their overall emissions by another 10% over the next 5 years. They recently completed the installation of 200 solar panels, which are now providing a third of their electricity. And you can see some of their solar panels here behind a new vine shoot. Finally, we have 362 Wines, founded by winemaker Alice Rule. Alice is a staunch industry advocate for sustainable and circular models of production. Her label uses plastic-free packaging, New Zealand-made Forest Stewardship Alliance recycled boxes and inserts, and low-weight glass bottles. They also plant 362 trees each vintage in a Trees for Bees initiative. 362 are carbon negative, so they measure, reduce, and offset more than 200% of their carbon emissions. They were an early adopter of a point-of-sale offsetting option through a company called Carbon Click, where customers can opt to pay a small fee to offset the emissions associated with the freight of their wine. The fees go to a verified, credible offsetting project, and customers getting tracking number to see where their money was actually used, which is pretty cool. 362 very much operate with the concept of kaitiakitanga, or guardianship of the land, at the forefront of everything they do. Alice undertook a research project through the Kellogg Rural Leadership Program, looking into glass packaging, which represents around around 35% of our industry's emissions footprint. Specifically, the sustainability performance of New Zealand's glass recovery infrastructure and how this plays a role for both consumers and producers in tackling the largest single contributor to the life cycle emissions of our wine. Alice's message around glass is that although it contributes significantly to our industry's footprint, it is circular, meaning it can be infinitely recycled without degrading in quality, and it is inert, meaning if in the worst case the glass is not recycled, it will eventually break back down into minerals and not cause any form of environmental degradation. This is significant in a world that is drowning in single-use plastic waste. Alice's call to action is around the use of lightweight bottles, which are produced locally, where we have a high percentage of recycled glass. Having bottles made with 10% more recycled material results in a 5% reduction in emissions per bottle due to lower heating requirements and fewer raw materials being used. Every ton of glass recycled saves approximately 670 kilos of CO2 compared to using raw materials. Also, the heavier the glass, the more energy that needs to be used to transport it. So a message Alice is getting out there is that lightweight glass is in no way an indicator of low quality wine. It's an indicator of lower emissions. Her research showed that while glass obviously has those embodied emissions, New Zealand is pretty well advanced with respect to reducing the climate impact of glass. We're currently recycling over 75% of glass, and the Glass Packaging Forum has a goal to have 82% recycled by 2024. And importantly, Alice has also put the challenge to us as the industry body to encourage New Zealand's only glass manufacturer to continue down an emissions reduction pathway for our glass produced here, and also to improve their transparency around emissions associated with their production, so that companies going through carbon inventory exercises can improve their accuracy. So a big thank you for having me here today. I hope that gives you all a good little snapshot of the climate work that goes into producing that bottle of wine from across the ditch here in New Zealand.